All right, we're doing it. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Status Coup. The date is February 21st. It's a Wednesday. That's why I'm here. It's Wednesdays. I'm Ron Placone. I am your host. We have a very, very jam packed show for you today. There's a story. The Supreme Court is going against the EPA on some environmental regulations. Surprise, surprise. We also have an update on the Kroger Albertsons merger, which is, I think, one of the biggest domestic stories going on right now that is being largely ignored, with exception to a small handful of outlets here, Status Coup being one of them. But the bulk of today's show is going to be around the Julian Assange case. Again, Status Coup is among the outlets that has been covering the Julian Assange case for years now, and things are coming to a head at any moment now, really. The past 2 days, there has been the hearing to give the ruling as to whether or not he is going to be extradited to the United States. And if he is extradited to the United States, that is the worst possible news, pretty much. So here to unpack all this with me is one of the more prolific, prominent journalists on this beat. He's been covering it for years. I've read his stuff for a long time. He is the curator of The Dissenter. Please welcome to the show, Kevin Gosztola. Kevin, how are you?
Hey, hello. It's good to be with you today.
Thanks for being here. So there's a lot to unpack. Let's start. Let's start at day one. Day one's in the past. That was yesterday. But let's kind of give a brief summary of what happened there, and then kind of get to present. So in day one, they made the case. It was the defense for him making their case. They said that they pointed out that there was the plan to assassinate him, which, boy, did that get virtually no coverage when it was dropped. But they brought that up. They brought up the fact that he would not be given a fair trial in the United States because, why would they start now? And then they brought up just all kinds of other factors. Could you sort of just summarize what were the main components of day one?
Yeah, and then I don't want to take for granted that people may not actually understand what was happening here. This is a permission for an appeal. So they go before the High Court of Justice in the UK, Assange and his team, and they say, we think that the government, actually, there was two things happening here, which is kind of confusing. They were appealing that the UK government authorized extradition, and then they were also appealing that the lower district court had authorized extradition. And so they go before the High Court of Justice and they put these grounds for appeal before them. And all of them are very substantial, in my opinion. And what they do is they pick apart the district court's ruling, or this district judge, her name was Vanessa Baretzer. And it's kind of complicated in the way that we talk about her, because usually we would say that she got everything wrong. Like, you would think if they were at this stage appealing that she got everything wrong and it was a horrible, horrible decision. But there was this silver lining to it, in the sense that even though she said that Julian Assange was not a journalist and he didn't have these rights that should be protected for the actions that he engaged in, she believed that if he was extradited to the United States, it would be oppressive for mental health reasons, that his mental health condition would be so poor that he would try to commit suicide while in U.S. detention or in a U.S. prison. And then that got litigated over the last several years, and eventually Julian Assange lost. And so that's why we're here today, still talking about an extradition case. But this was an opportunity, a first opportunity for Assange to basically challenge the bulk of that district court decision that got so much wrong. And so we're talking about things that are really in the legal weeds, and I don't want to overwhelm people. This is not like some, like legal schnauzer show or whatever, where we talk about the different statutes and different provisions of the law with like very fine, minute. But the treaty does say that you're not supposed to extradite for political offenses, and espionage has traditionally been considered a political offense. And the reason being is, if you just think about it, anyone that's usually accused of espionage against their government is doing it, it's directed at the government. And that act of espionage might not be a crime in various other countries. It depends on what you do. So because it is so politically charged, usually governments don't extradite people back to the country that is claiming they committed treason or espionage against the government. A lot of times in that scenario, you're talking about the risk of torture for that person. There's a provision that says if you're targeted for your political opinions, you should not be extradited. That's a big part of the proceedings yesterday, that Julian Assange engaged in political actions. They were motivated by his political opinions, and that the US government has indicted him. In particular, we're talking here about the Trump officials at the Justice Department. And Jeff Sessions was the attorney general at the time that he was indicted, and later Bill Barr presided over it. So that this extradition basically for against Julian Assange was targeting him because he engaged in these political actions, had these political opinions. So they say very clearly, this is a politically motivated case. And then, like you said, you raised the issue of the CIA allegedly plotting to kill him. That was brought in. That's fresh evidence. As far as the timeline goes, none of that was available to the district court from Yahoo News until now. And it's remarkable. I know Status Coup spent some time on this yesterday. I was following that because Jordan had actually invited me onto the show, and I had a previously scheduled press conference or rally in Chicago that I had to go to speak about Julian Assange. The government actually says of this article that they believe that the authors of it, they try to discredit it by saying that the authors of it are people who support Julian Assange. Oh my God. And it's kind of funny because the authors on it are Michael Isikoff, a journalist named Sean Naylor, and another journalist named Zach Dorfman. And they might be against indicting Julian Assange and prosecuting him and bringing him to this country, but so are 90 to 95% of journalists around the world at this point, because they recognize what it's going to do. And then there are various degrees of support, right? Like, how far are they willing to go? We quibble and jostle and pester them because, for the most part, they aren't regularly raising this matter. It's like they do the token thing, they do the bare minimum, and then they get on with their lives and they say, oh, we checked the box. We showed that we are against this. And now we get to pretend like that's all we really need to do in order to address or resolve the matter. But yeah, I'd say like those are the big things about day one. Day one was that they're raising all of this. They're saying things like he could be exposed to the death penalty. They're saying things like there's the fact that the judge didn't appropriately acknowledge that state crimes were exposed by WikiLeaks. That's a good point to close on here before I end this response to you for day one, because they point out that, we were exposing drone strikes that killed civilians. WikiLeaks did that. Torture was exposed, that there were war crimes that were exposed. That in particular, a very big example is that there was a person named Khalid al-Masri who was abducted by the CIA. The CIA tortured him. And then he took his case to the European Court of Human Rights. And before the European Court of Human Rights, he showed them cables that WikiLeaks had published, which came from Chelsea Manning. And these cables had evidence that helped confirm the role of the CIA, or the role, of Macedonia, because that was who he took to the European Court of Human Rights. He couldn't actually take the CIA to the European Court of Human Rights, but he took the European country that was involved, or they took the European state that was involved in being the oppressor of him, of engaging in this act. And he ended up winning. He won before the European Court of Human Rights, and he used these diplomatic cables.
So a couple of things here, still on day one. I wanted to ask you, and you brought it up, the situation with the death penalty, there was this tweet from you, Colin. If we can pull up Kevin's tweet here, UK statute prohibits extradition if the requested person, in this case Assange, would be at risk of the death penalty. The fact that a UK government lawyer accepts that Assange could be extradited and then face additional charges that carry the death penalty is a big deal. What are the details of those additional charges that could lead to the death penalty?
Yeah, so this came up on day 2, but I think that the defense was also raising this on the first day. So we discussed this material that is lesser known, and it's called Vault 7 materials. These are have received more attention primarily because of, if you follow any of the conversation about the CIA targeting Assange, this is why. Mike Pompeo was livid and he believed that the CIA was special because WikiLeaks hadn't happened to them before. They hadn't been WikiLeaked, I guess, if you want to make that some kind of a verb. But and in fact, they privately mocked the State Department. They mocked the Pentagon because they had trouble securing their information and WikiLeaks had gotten to them, but they hadn't gotten to the CIA. Then they did. And there was this massive leak, it was the largest leak in CIA history. And that leaker was actually just sentenced to prison, which is kind of important to our conversation today. I might come back to it later, but these Vault 7 materials are not part of the indictment. It's not charged. And what we have here is what you call uncharged misconduct. And sometimes you'll have prosecutors that bring charges against someone. And then later on during sentencing, after they've won a conviction, they'll look at all these other things that you've done as a person, and they'll add to the sentence. They'll make your sentence longer effectively by raising this uncharged misconduct. And you may say, well, shouldn't you just charge them with a crime before, and then you can go before a jury and the jury can decide whether to convict you? Well, if you think you have a weaker case on it, you just put the material in a sentencing memo before a judge or a jury, and you see if they think that will help them to feel like they could give a person a harsher sentence than they would receive if you didn't introduce it. So they can do that to Julian Assange, and there's misconduct that they could raise and put before a judge during sentencing. So yeah, I feel like this could be dizzying to some people. When you do the trial, you do the standard portion that we all know from courtroom dramas, and everyone hears the arguments and the jury says verdict, guilty or not guilty. And then after that, we have another phase that sometimes isn't always the subject of drama, and you are sentenced to prison. So during that sentencing phase, they can mention Vault 7 materials. They can mention hacking allegations that have been unsubstantiated that are also in this indictment. They can raise things that are not particularly crimes, but they can say that that's what Julian Assange did, and they can add extra time to him. And if they would want to, they could introduce the death penalty if they thought that he had engaged in like treason against the United States or something of that nature. And there's no assurance. That's what was a big deal about today, is the High Court Justice asked a prosecutor, was actually a government lawyer from the UK, not from the group that is representing the US government's extradition. So the UK government lawyer was asked, is there any way to get an assurance that the death penalty won't be added to this case? And the government attorney said, in principle, no, there really isn't any way to get that assurance.
Wow.
So again, I would like to tell you that at different phases of this case, the US government has undermined their own case by being stupid. And that is to say that, and that's given openings to Julian Assange. But like earlier, he won at the district court level and was spared, and she refused to extradite him because they wouldn't say, no, we won't put him in something called special administrative measures, which is essentially a form of torture. That like they put you in this high security prison. Particularly there's a supermax prison in ADX. Sorry, it's in Florence, Colorado. It's called ADX Florence. And mostly they send like terrorists there, people who are convicted of crimes. But there's all this evidence about how you deteriorate your mental health and what it does to you. And that resonated deeply with the judge. So she ruled against extradition. And they resolved that by saying to the high court that, hey, we just won't put him in special administrative measures. There's a loophole, but they actually said something to the judges that we wouldn't do it. All they have to do to win this case is just start paying lip service to this idea of like, oh, okay, we won't do that. Oh, okay, we won't do that. And sometimes they just don't do it. Like another thing they're having an issue with is whether Julian Assange would have First Amendment rights at trial. And they're saying, no, he won't. He's an Australian. He's not a U.S. citizen, which is actually not how it works, because when you are in U.S. custody, you get all the constitutional rights of a U.S. citizen.
So let me jump in just for a second here, because I wanted to ask you specifically about this. So finish your thought on this, but then I also want you to address this part too. It seems like various times throughout this case, they treat him like a U.S. citizen when it's convenient for them, but then when it's not convenient for them, all of a sudden they're like, well, but he's not a U.S. citizen. And I feel like, when they're bringing up treason this, treason that, well, he's not a U.S. citizen, but then it's like, well, he should have First Amendment rights. Well, hold on, he's not a U.S. citizen. And it's like, the hypocrisy is just so right there in your face.
Yeah, and this was I brought this to the attention of the former general counsel of the New York Times. His name is James Goodale, and he was involved in arguing that the Pentagon Papers, there was a right to publish those. Of course, that came from Daniel Ellsberg and exposed the Vietnam War. And I said to him, and I think he might have said this before, but I got to have a conversation with him a few years ago about this point that you're raising, which is, if you're expected to follow the U.S. Espionage Act and not violate it, don't you have constitutional rights? Like, don't you, if you're supposed to adhere to U.S. laws, don't you get the constitutional protections that come from being someone who's supposed to obey those very laws? Like, we get protections. Like you get protections. Everybody in the United States, traditionally speaking, have these protections. If they are accused of violating the law, then they get to use those protections while they are on trial. And so that should be the case for Julian Assange. That's really what we're talking about here. And I think what's happening is there's this confusion, because what they're saying is that they don't believe that Julian Assange engaged in First Amendment protected activities when he published the documents. And then what's coming out is they're saying, oh, he has no First Amendment rights. And then they're saying, well, the court and the defense is saying, do you mean when he's in custody? If he's in trial, he wouldn't have First Amendment rights? And they're saying, yeah, we can say that. And then they're getting themselves in trouble, because that's actually not true. You would have First Amendment protections while you're on trial. It has actually nothing to do with the conduct. And but this is what I think people see when they're so brazen about how they are depriving Julian Assange of his rights. I mean, it's very clear that this conduct should be protected by the First Amendment. It just should be. I mean, there's so much evidence out there that this is what journalists do on a regular basis. So it should be protected.
So let's get into day 2 then. This was basically today, and the prosecution had their big moments. So what were some of the highlights of the most recent activity?
To me, the biggest thing about the prosecution is that they do this thing that's very convenient to me, where they try to murk the waters so that they can ensure that Julian Assange will be extradited. So, for example, the judge might ask them about something that would be an issue of fact, and they'll say, oh, you know what, actually, like, Julian Assange was involved in telling Chelsea Manning that he would help her access military computers that didn't belong to her. And you look at the indictment and it'll say, well, that's not actually what she's charged with. That's not what the indictment says. It says that they accused Julian Assange of trying to help her move anonymously through the computer systems so that the US military wouldn't know that she was accessing the documents. It wasn't that, oh, now she's going to go get on these computers that don't belong to her. I don't even know what that means because she doesn't own computers. They're the military computers. But this is what the prosecutor said to the high court judge. And then what happens is the high court justice or the judges, they get confused and they're like, I don't really know what's right. The defense says one thing, the prosecutors say another thing. Let's just extradite him and we'll let the judge at the trial figure it out. Like, what's the fact? Like, was he helping her hide on the computers or was he trying to steal the computers? We don't know. And then like, that's what happens. Like they're intentionally making it difficult for them to have clarity and fully understand what's happening with the case. So to me, that's what stands out. But then also there is that fact that they're just blatantly saying he's not an ordinary journalist or he's not a responsible journalist is one term that they throw out there. And to just basically deny this whole idea that, you know, he was engaged in these standard news gathering activities. And then taking offense, I was really struck too, taking offense to this idea that the US government would lie or be deceitful when telling the high court or just even the lower court about the case, that there are certain things that are being hidden and that this case could be politically motivated. Like the prosecutors took this attitude before the high court that it's extremely offensive for them to suggest that the US, since they have a treaty with the UK that allows them extradition, that they would somehow abuse it by telling lies about people that they're trying to extradite. But, you know, they have to recognize that that happens. It's not like every single person who's ever been requested has been extradited to the United States. There are people, they may be few, but there are people who have prevailed in their extradition cases. And in one way or another, it was probably because the UK courts could see through what the US government was asking. There's actually he was accused of hacking, but his name's Lori Love. And it was several years ago and is relevant to this case because he has some of the mental health conditions that are like similar to Julian Assange. And some of that played a role in him being spared and not extradited to the United States for a trial. And, you know, he didn't get extradited. So was it offensive for the defense team to suggest that the U.S. was hiding their motivations, that they weren't telling the truth, that there might have been something more going on behind their request? And you look at this case, and it's basically like, well, what we're talking about here are Trump officials that seriously despise Julian Assange, and not because they didn't like that he revealed Clinton campaign emails, but because there was a whole other part of Julian Assange that they did not want to support. And it's the part that was against U.S. wars. It's the part that was against U.S. war crimes. And at the same time, this was brought into the court on day one, but you'll notice, you know, and I notice on day two that they don't really deal with this. And some people don't really realize that this was going on parallel to the Assange case. But the Trump administration waged a war against the International Criminal Court when Trump was in office. And they did so because the International Criminal Court said they were going to do an investigation of the Afghanistan war, and they were going to investigate war crimes that were committed by every party in the war. So the Taliban, the US military, the Afghan military, and those groups were going to all be investigated by this International Criminal Court. We say, whoa, Pompeo is offended, Trump is offended, all these people are saying, you are not going to subject US military forces to this investigation. And then you have Trump and Pompeo threatening the International Criminal Court. And Trump even issued sanctions against people. Like anyone who helped this investigation was facing sanctions. And so this is going on at the same time that they push this extradition and these charges against Julian Assange, who exposed wars, who exposed torture, who exposed drone strikes. That needs to be a part of our understanding of how this goes forward, that these officials who indicted Julian Assange did so because they do not support people knowing the truth about U.S. wars.
So let's go to some CNN footage. I want to, kind of pivot over to some of the corporate media's coverage of this. Can we play the CNN video, Colin, and then Kevin, I look forward to your response.
But it's my organization's position, and actually that of his own defense, that this was done in the public interest. The leaked classified documents informed public interest reporting around the world. And if Assange is prosecuted in this way, the precedent would then be set that could apply to journalists and media organizations, to many others. It's a normal journalistic practice to report on the basis of leaked information. We'll see this afternoon if the U.S. government will respond to some quite shocking information discussed yesterday about this allegations of CIA officials plotting his possible kidnapping or assassination. We haven't yet heard the U.S. take that on in court, but that could happen this afternoon.
Yeah, and the question the judges will have on that is, what evidence do you have of that assertion? But back to your point about this is what reporters and journalists do, the counter argument to that, and you wrote a really interesting op-ed in The Guardian that I would encourage everyone to read, making this case. The counter argument to that is his points could have been made public that included redactions of some of the most sensitive classified information. The other question becomes, if that becomes the precedent, does it encourage more cyber threats, more release of very sensitive information? That is a differentiator here, and I wonder how you respond to that.
So that's quite a complicated area of the case that tends to be overly simplified, because it wasn't actually WikiLeaks that initially published the unredacted data set. An unusual series of circumstances led to the disclosure of the password by one of the media partners that WikiLeaks had worked with. Another party accessed it and was the first to publish. We've heard evidence in previous court proceedings of how Assange tried to stop that, how he then called the White House and the State Department, warned them that publication was coming, urged them to take action to protect anybody who might be harmed. So it's not as straightforward as it looks, and it's not as simple as him putting people at risk. He actually tried to avert risks. And so it's really complex and doesn't often get the time in court or the time in public debate that should merit.
Mic drop moment from her. I mean, it's like, it's amazing that to me, and I'm looking forward to your response, but it's amazing to me that they just brought up two very easily already debunked points. I mean, first of all, they just casually said, well, we need some evidence of that, as if the entire Yahoo investigation didn't happen. They're just ignoring that, or maybe they don't even know about it. And then, the whole thing like, oh, well, they published this sensitive stuff. It's just like, yeah, and so did The Guardian. So I would like your response to that video.
It's like they got to keep up a storyline from yesterday, because we all know that their reporter in London said, oh, wow, we got these bombshell claims that were just dropped in court, even though they weren't, because we all heard about the alleged plot from the CIA back in 2021. I mean, nobody could claim to not know that this was being put out there. And it's like, what are you doing? Is this CNN reporter really that unknowledgeable about the case? It's certainly possible many of these people just don't follow it. And then they show up. And then, as was my experience back when I was covering Chelsea Manning's court-martial in 2013, I'm this 20-something newbie journalist, and I've got the Washington Post reporter, national security correspondent, coming up to me and asking that I help her understand what's going on, because she's confused. So maybe he doesn't know, but also maybe there's this whole thing of like, oh, whoa, the defense is introducing this idea that there might be a conspiracy theory going on against Julian Assange in the government. And we just have to shut that down because we can't have that. That's unhealthy to democracy. And, there's been this whole thing, this whole strain within liberal intelligentsia and among establishment Democrats that, oh man, we got to shut this down because so many Republicans and right wingers try to make up conspiracies about Joe Biden and everything. And like, maybe they think that this is part of some culture that now the defense has gone into the UK court and they're suggesting that the US government conspires against Julian Assange. So I don't know. I'm just struggling. I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to find an explanation for why we're treated to this foolishness. But then today, what we hear is about as bad. It's about as bad to sit there and say that we need to extradite Julian Assange to protect against cyber threats to the United States is about as stupid and dumb as saying we need to extradite him so the FBI can question him and get to the bottom of Trump-Russia collusion. This is something that was actually put out there when he was first arrested. I remember watching a CNN clip. I think it might have been Wolf Blitzer. I'm not entirely certain, but at some point there were questions that were put out there seriously that, wouldn't it be good to get him here so we could get to the bottom of what happened between Trump and Russia in the 2016 election? And frankly, the idea that you would sacrifice freedom of the press just so you could get an FBI agent in the room with Julian Assange is horrendous. It's just awful to think that that's even something that would cross your mind as a news anchor, or even just like a producer would put that question out there for everyone so that we could engage with it. It's just ridiculous. And so, yeah, I'm baffled, but I'm glad that the guest that's there is Rebecca Vincent. And for people who don't know Rebecca Vincent of Reporters Without Borders, she and her group have done tremendous work on this. They've fought and they've persevered through a number of media access issues. For several years, the UK courts actually would not let them into proceedings to cover and view the Assange case. And so what they would do is Rebecca would go in the morning, and an activist from one of the Assange support groups who had stood in line for hours, probably got up at like 4 a.m. They would go, they would take their spot in line that this Assange supporter had held, and then they would get in and they'd have a seat in the very small public gallery. And that just shows you their dedication. And she also fought, their whole group did over the last year to get prison visits with Julian Assange. First they were denied, but they've been able to see him multiple times now. The commitment is strong. And so, the idea that Poppy Harlow there is going to float some debunked claim to Rebecca Vincent and get away with it. She should have tried it on another guest.
So I wanted to talk briefly about his health situation then. I mean, I've read some stuff over the past few days. He allegedly broke a rib from coughing, which is wow. I mean, it's really, when you take a step back and you look at the humanity of it all, and the fact that this guy's been in, under conditions that no human should be under for any period of time, let alone a decade. What's your kind of analysis of all that?
Yeah, this is horrible here. This is one of those things that really hits home for you, just how cruel it has been to be in this arbitrary detention. In some way or another, he has been in arbitrary detention, we have to recognize, since the end of December 2010. And obviously he wasn't indicted for these charges yet, but he could have been. And he was afraid that there were going to be charges because a grand jury was impaneled. Attorney General Eric Holder impaneled it pretty much immediately. And it was around the same time of the U.S. diplomatic cables being published at the end of November, early December. 15 years of arbitrary detention. And at one point, a United Nations working group recognized that he had been in arbitrary detention. And that included then being in the London embassy, Ecuador's London embassy. And he has not had sunlight. So someone who is reading this, it doesn't take it. You don't have to be that much of an expert on science. If you understand human health, you put it together. If you can't go outdoors and you can't get vitamin D, then your bone health suffers. And that's how you get osteoporosis. And so what we can recognize, if Julian Assange has this condition where coughing leads to a broken rib, this is because he's not allowed to go outdoors. He's not getting recreation time at Belmarsh. And we know that he's not getting more than maybe, I mean, I don't know what he's getting, but he doesn't really go outdoors there. I know there's some area where he can go to have some recreation, but I don't believe that he's getting sunlight when he gets to do that recreation, from what I've read. And then obviously he couldn't go outside when he was in the London embassy. And that's because if he went outside, he would be snatched up by the British police. So he stayed inside the whole time and his body degraded. He had poor teeth as well. He couldn't go see a dentist. They couldn't bring the machinery in to take care of him. You know, there are a lot of different things that we heard evidence in this extradition case so far from doctors, and there are ailments that he wasn't able to be treated. And then he went to Belmarsh, and they do have a dedicated healthcare team. And it's rather astonishing that you can say this facility is known as Britain's Guantanamo because of the fact that it will hold terrorists that the UK prosecutes. And yet he's getting better healthcare than you would in a US prison facility because he has a team that is committed to his health. There is a team that has been committed to his health. I'm not saying that the conditions have been good for Julian Assange, but what I'm saying is if he comes to the United States and he's in pretrial detention or he's in prison, I don't know how long he lasts. This is a 52-year-old man whose bones are breaking when he coughs. How long do you think he's going to survive solitary confinement in the Alexandria City Jail while he's awaiting trial? This is just outside of DC. This is the facility where Chelsea Manning was put. I'll refresh people's memory that for a year, the US government, the Justice Department, held her in contempt, had a court hold her in contempt because Chelsea Manning refused to testify against Julian Assange and basically rat out the publisher who made all these leaks possible, everything that she got to share with the world possible. And she's decided, on principle, I'm going to go to jail and I'm going to fight this. And she was there for a year until she was finally released. They kind of had to. There was a pandemic, a global pandemic, but she attempted suicide in the days before she was released. The detention facility did not stop her from attempting suicide. I would say that that's scary. If Julian Assange is going to be extradited here and he's a very smart individual, it's recognized that he will probably find a way to self-harm if he could. And the idea that negligence or deliberate indifference could mean that he takes his life in a U.S. facility, that definitely should wear on anyone who cares about the outcome of this case.
So let's watch one more video here. Let's hear from Stella Assange, Julian's wife.
The world is watching, and finally, there's a realization about what this is really about, which is an attack on the truth, an attack on the public's right to know, and a country's attempt to further their impunity and their cover-ups and continue to kill with impunity without the threat of a media that will scrutinize them, of a public that will demand change. That cannot stand. Everything turns on the outcome of this case. Whether states can criminalize journalism and put journalists in prison like they've been doing in the UK with an Australian citizen, a publisher who's won many, many awards for his journalism, and they've stuck him in the deepest, darkest hole of the UK prison system, and the US threatens to put him in the deepest, darkest hole of the US prison system for 175 years. Shame. Julian's imprisonment is the result of people with too much power who lost the plot, who got power thirsty and are guilty. They know they're guilty and they want to continue to live their lives without any consequences for the crimes they've committed. This case is about whether state crimes can continue unpunished, unscrutinized. Julian's freedom is the only antidote. We don't have a decision today. Julian's life is at severe risk every single day he is in prison. He is a political prisoner. He is the world's most famous political prisoner. We know what happened to the other most famous political prisoner last week. That cannot happen to Julian.
Yeah, this whole thing has been beyond chilling, especially when you just kind of look at the humanity of it all and how they are just, if they can't get him to the United States, they're just going to, slowly try to kill him, just through the conditions and through his bones deteriorating. It's just, I mean, viewing this whole thing for years has been just mind blowing.
Yeah. And, just to provide a little levity and give people a break from the chilling nature of this, I get invited to do a lot of shows, and some of them are around the world. And sometimes I recognize just how much of a killjoy I'm going to be when I show up on someone's program and give them the reality of this case. But I was invited on a breakfast show in New Zealand, and I went on the show for 5 minutes, and the host was really good, but you really know what you're about to do as you're listening to them discuss the topic that is a breakfast show topic before you go on air.
So wait, real quick. When you say breakfast show, do you just mean like a morning show, or do you mean like they actually have breakfast there?
Oh, they call themselves breakfast. They call it was
okay.
It was called, they called it breakfast. It's a New Zealand radio program. I think it was on TV New Zealand or something.
I was just imagining they're sitting there with omelets, so they're just like, tell us about this assault on the free press. And then you just kind of go off and they're like, wow, none of us are hungry anymore. Thanks, Kevin. Like,
that's kind of how I felt, though, because before this 40-something-year-old woman, and she's a mother, and then an indigenous broadcaster, they have Maori people in New Zealand, he was on air with them, and they're asking each other about this idea that you can have more health, your health will be better, your well-being will be improved if you don't sleep in the same bed as your spouse. And they're a little baffled, like they're kind of like, how could this be? Tell me about it. I thought that like if you were doing that, you're separated, you might be headed for a divorce or something. And I'm sitting here just giggling because I'm about to talk about this very grim topic of a journalist that is essentially being assassinated by the US government in slow motion. And, and then the anchor who interviews me, she reveals like, hey, actually, I'm doing this myself. I sleep in separate beds from my husband. I'm just like, okay. And then I come on the air and this little like happy, no stakes conversation that they're having gets transformed into something that is very real for all of us that we need to face. And they approached the topic seriously. It was a very good interview. They listened to what I had to say, and later they praised me for giving a good overview. But I add that as to illustrate an example for everyone that it is kind of hard at this point to talk to people about this. We have let this get so bad that now the response from some is almost identical to when people get to know what's going on in Gaza, quite frankly. I mean, It's like, holy crap, what are you going to do? We can't fix this easily? And then they just want to walk away from it. And that's my, like, there are some people that I have engaged with on Assange that aren't opponents. There are people who just go, oh God, and then they're
didn't
done
know.
with it. They're
Yeah,
done with it.
or oh, right, yeah, or I mean, I've encountered some people in my personal life where it's like they're desensitized to it because they only heard a couple MSNBC sound bites and they think that that's the story. They just don't know what's really going on. And then
Yeah.
when you break it down for them, they're like, "Oh, wait a second, that's what's happening."
I have a brother-in-law who's confused. He was confused when I told him. I said he's being extradited. What did he do? Well, he published this information. Huh. You could be extradited for that? It's just like I explain it to him the way that I explain things, and I say, well, this is like what journalists do all the time, and this was this, and he did it back in 2010, and they're just doing it now. Really? This can happen? I said, yeah, they're doing this.
I heard this thing about sleeping in the same bed with your spouse. Not trying to switch gears, but well,
Yeah.
so when is there, and I know we're kind of just speculating here, but has there been any indication of a timeline when they will reach a conclusion on this? I know that the second day is concluding as of now. But when might we know something more?
Days or weeks.
Wow.
If the past is any indication, they could take as long as they would like. I mean, remember, everything I can tell you here is enough to make you feel like the world is come to an end. And so this appeal was requested back in 2022 by his team. I mean, the extradition was authorized by the UK government in the summer of 2022. They immediately appealed. And then it took almost a year for a decision to come from, and this is where it starts to feel like a Mel Brooks parody, because the name of the judge that issued the extradition decision to deny an appeal or not grant an appeal hearing, his name was Sir Justice Swift.
Yeah.
And
I remember.
Sir Justice Swift just had like a few lines and didn't really even deal with any of the important information that was put to him. So the team said, all right, we're not going to accept this, obviously. We need to save Julian Assange. And his attorneys reintroduced another packet that the High Court had for 7-8 months before they got this on the schedule. It was about a half of a year before they got this on the schedule. And we got a hearing, this 2-day hearing. It is possibly the final UK hearing for Julian Assange. If he is granted a full appeal hearing, he will get something that'll probably last. I would bet it would go for a week, maybe a week and a half. It depends, though, but it should be a pretty substantial hearing. Just because there's so many details to go over, so many things being challenged. We're talking. It does also depend on what the High Court accepts. So let's say there were like 8 or 9 grounds for appeal. They can look at those and say, we only see 2 as being reasonable. We'll give you a hearing and we'll let you argue those points. So then maybe it could be a 1 or 2 day hearing, but he could have another chance to stop the extradition. If no, then he gets to appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. But there's a catch there, because that is a petition that doesn't often get taken up by the European Court of Human Rights. They'll get something like 60 or 70 of these in a year. That's what I've been told. And they maybe will take like 3 or 4 of them and do proceedings on them. But if they grant the petition, then he'll be able to not go to the United States. Of course, we would like that, but he will remain in prison in Belmarsh. And that's not good. There's really no scenario here where he gets to have bail and get out of prison and then just be free while he is litigating and arguing that he shouldn't be extradited. And that's shameful, absolutely shameful throughout this whole saga. So we're talking about it being close, super close to extradition to the United States. If the UK government feels that they don't have to wait for Julian Assange, if there's any way that they think they could hand him over to the US and get him out of here, they might be willing to test everything and just, wash their hands of Julian Assange. It has been such an ordeal for them. They really do not like having to deal with him in their country. I mean, I think they hate Julian Assange, as do everyone in the US government, obviously, as they push this case against him. So what can we do? What can we all do, and what might give us a little bit of hope? I
was just going to ask you that because you've been a big buzzkill on my breakfast show. So
I know we should be talking about interpersonal relationships a little bit more. It might be a nice diversion. Anyways, the good news was just before this, the Australian Parliament and the Australian Prime Minister actually directly told the US government by passing a motion that they all supported that the US government must drop the charges against Julian Assange and return one of their citizens back to his home country. Should return Julian Assange to Australia immediately. There wasn't any equivocating, hedging. It was plain. We don't care what you say he did. This should be over. Send him to Australia now. We don't want to allow this prosecution, or we don't want to see this prosecution continue. And so we're seeing unprecedented support for Julian Assange. I don't think if you go back to 2019, there had been this many groups, this many journalists. He's now been granted honorary membership in 20 to 30 journalist unions in Europe. They just made him a member so that he could have this as like a way of moral support and solidarity while he fights the United States.
Honorary citizenship in Rome.
Yeah, there's that too. These are all big deals. We have the Mexico president, Obrador, going to Biden, raising this in meetings. Lula in Brazil saying that Julian Assange must be freed. You have people throughout the world taking this up as an issue. And it exposes the hypocrisy, right? I think it makes it hard. It makes it extremely difficult for the US government to argue that other journalists, even our own US journalists, should be freed. How do you convince Russia to free Evan Gershkovich, who's a Wall Street Journal reporter? This has gotten a lot of attention in the press. How do you convince him to be freed when the United States government is keeping Julian Assange in a prison? I'm pretty sure Putin is going to look at Assange every single day and say, if he's in jail, you're not getting Evan Gershkovich back. I have a right to do whatever I want to a reporter because you're treating Julian Assange the same way. So I think that we have an opportunity here, but there is a lot of work that still has to be done. It is sad that there are only 12 members of Congress out of 435 that are willing to support a resolution to free Julian Assange and basically say the First Amendment protects freedom of the press. Therefore, the Justice Department should drop charges against Julian Assange. But however, there's Republicans and there are Democrats that are willing to support Julian Assange. I think that there's a lot about this that is very easy. If you just talk about it and you inform people and you make them aware of what's going on, it's pretty easy to get them to recognize that this should be over. And just on this, I'll end with this. If you can't get them to see it on principle that journalism needs to be protected and that it's under threat, you can at least communicate this. He's been in prison for 5 years. Under the Espionage Act, most people, I know all about these prosecutions, save it for another time to get into them. But when you go to prison, truthfully and honestly, you usually only go to prison if you aren't in the military. You would get sentenced for like 5 to 6 years. Julian Assange has been in prison for almost 5 years. He should be able to get off and not face this anymore because the US government would accept that he had been in prison for 5 years. That should be considered time served. let him be free, and just take it as you got the punishment you wanted for Julian Assange. You destroyed him. He's never going to lead WikiLeaks again. He can't. He's even said and admitted that they can't be a part of publishing war crimes and exposing war crimes in Ukraine or Gaza because the U.S. government destroyed WikiLeaks. So take that as the victory. That's what the U.S. national security state should do, and just let him go, because he's probably not going to be an editor-in-chief in Australia. He's going to go live with his family and privately rebuild his life, and he'll probably never be the figure that he was back in 2010.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today and being so generous with your time, and thank you for all the work you do on this beat. I mean, it has been incredible. You are one of the most prominent sources on this that I have leaned on for a long time now. So thank you for that, and for continuing to do it, because if it wasn't for journalists like yourself, this story I think would really just fall by the wayside, because God knows the corporate media is going to continue to ignore it or misrepresent it. So thank you for that. Let people know where they can find The Dissenter.
Yeah, and I know we're at the end of the show, but let me just quick tell people that Mohammed Almazi was the reporter who was in London for me. I hired him and paid him to report on the proceedings. So if you go to the Dissenter newsletter at thedissenter.org, you can read the reporting on day 1 and day 2. And that's where I'll continue to post updates on the Assange case. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks for being here, man. Good to see you. All right, guys, check out The Dissenter, and there are reasons for hope, even though, whenever the Assange case comes up, it's hard not to feel helpless, because we are just seeing this ridiculous assault of justice right before our very eyes, and it's been years. I wanted to talk a little bit about one more story today. I knew that we were going to dominate most of the show to Assange, but there are still a few things I'd like to talk about. First of all, guys, please do smash the like button, like this stream, share this stream, leave me a super chat if you want. I'd love to chat with you here as we're wrapping up here. And also, there is going to be a members call tomorrow night. Tomorrow night at 7:30 Eastern time, there's going to be a members call with Jordan. You can go to statuscoup.com/join. Remember, when you join here at Status Coup, you are supporting on-the-ground journalism. You're supporting Status Lou going to East Palestine. You're supporting Tina on the beat in Atlanta or Los Angeles. You're supporting Jordan on the beat. You're supporting Johnny F. doing it all. Johnny F. going on the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s. He's a one-man super show. That's what you're supporting. And your membership, hey, maybe someday Status Cool will be in Status Cool. You know what? Status Coup is Status Cool. I did that on purpose. I didn't, but let's pretend. Maybe someday Status Coup will be in a position where we can have people in London for the Julian Assange here. I mean, hopefully Julian Assange will be free and we won't have to, but you get the point I was trying to make. Hopefully someday we'll be able to have bureaus all around the world. That'd be amazing. So please go to statuscoup.com/join. You are supporting on the ground journalism, but we're going to go domestic here for a little bit, folks. And we're going to go to a story that I think is one of the most important domestic stories going on right now that is not getting a ton of attention. And that is the grocery merger. Let's go to the Reuters article, Colin. So the FTC, states could sue over the Kroger Albertsons $24.6 billion deal as soon as next week. So we've covered this some on Status Coup. This is being virtually ignored. But Albertsons and Kroger, they're trying to merge. If they would merge, that would be the biggest homogenization of our grocery chain, basically, ever in the history of the United States. And take note of when it is happening. It is happening during a time of rising grocery prices. Groceries prices are going through the gills right now. And two of the biggest grocery giants are trying to merge. What do you think that's going to do? That's going to first of all be terrible for jobs. They already said they were going to be laying people off. They made that clear. We covered it on this show. It's going to be terrible for prices because prices are already going up anyway. They'll lock in the high prices. You know why? Because you need food to survive. You don't have the choice between, well, if you make the prices too high, I'll just not have food. That's not an option for anybody. If you don't eat food, you frickin' die. So that is happening. And if that were to happen, I think a lot more people in this country are going to be food insecure. A lot more. I don't know how high the number is going to be. I don't think any of us can really project that. But I think it'll get really freaking bad. So here's what's going on. The U.S. Federal Trade Commission and a group of states could sue as soon as next week to block grocery Kroger's proposed $24.6 billion deal to buy smaller rival Albertsons. An agreement to not close the deal expires on February 28th. The lawsuit to block the deal is expected before that. So here's what a company spokesperson said. Kroger remains in ongoing discussions with the FTC and state regulators. Now, here's a just bold-faced lie. This merger is the best thing for America's consumers because it will lead to lower prices and more choices on the foods customers need, want, and love. It will do the opposite of all of that. Just so, despite what this PR professional had to say, it will do the opposite of all that. It will lead to higher prices. It will lead to less choices on food, and it'll lead to less jobs too. The companies, okay, the states of Colorado and Washington have already sued to block the deal, which has raised antitrust concerns over higher prices for consumers, store closures, and loss of jobs. We've already seen all of this happening, by the way. This is already happening in real time. Now, here's something that's a little frightening to see. Let's go to, Colin, let's go to the KATU piece about the union that actually supports this. Because there are some unions that are supporting this. Local union supports the Kroger and Albertsons merger. So a local food and commercial workers union says they are in support of a potential merger between Kroger and Albertsons grocery store. Right now, the FTC is deciding whether to allow the merger. If approved, the company would have to sell hundreds of stores to a third party. The union sharing its support is Local 555. I'm curious what their rationale is behind that. I'm curious why they're doing that, and I'm curious if this is the opinion of the rank and file or if some leaders just sort of decided this behind closed doors. But that is frightening and disturbing that any union, and by the way, there's some bad unions out there. And it's frightening that there is any union out there that would be okay with this. We've already seen a loss of jobs. They've already made it clear they're going to be stripping jobs. We covered that on this show. You can go find that video. I did a short on it a while back. We already have the freaking receipts showing they're going to take jobs away. They're going to merge and they're going to price gouge. Grocery prices are already going up. It is beyond frightening that any union would support this. And this is one of the biggest domestic stories going on right now that no one's covering. But if this thing goes through, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. Look, where I live in Los Angeles, where I live in LA, you are seeing more and more armed guards at grocery stores. Why do you think that is? It's because they are anticipating a near future where a lot of Americans are food insecure and they need to steal food to survive. And it'll happen everywhere. Well, that's just California. No, that can happen any freaking where, and it will. You're going to see more and more of that. So, shout out to Colorado and Washington State for doing something about it. But if we're counting on states, we're in a whole lot of trouble. If we can't rely on our antitrust legislatures, which we can't. Hey, Robert Smith of The Cure is more effective than our antitrust legislation in the United States. He did more fighting Ticketmaster than they did. A British singer did more to fight Ticketmaster than our antitrust legislators did. So, too bad Robert Smith can't help us out on this one. So, I wanted to talk about that briefly before we dismounted here. And guys, let me go ahead and get to some of the chats here. First of all, Tony, what's up, buddy? Hello, Ron. Hello, Tony. Freedom for Assange. You all rule. Thank you so much for that, Tony D. And thank you to We got a couple donations here. Let me thank you for that. Thanks for the donations, Jessica and Tony. Thank you guys so much for that. And again, statuscoup.com/donate if you are so able. I think the big theme for today's show, y'all, is tell people about this, for crying out loud. A lot of people don't know what's really going on with Julian Assange. If they did, they'd be louder about it. They'd be, but you know what? I have flipped some people in my personal life. I had some people, they repeated a corporate media trope about Julian Assange. And I'd say, you know what? Here's what's really going on. And I tell them stuff. They looked into it and they changed their mind about it. They're like, you know what? I feel differently about that issue now. Because I didn't know. I mean, a lot of people that they just, and it's not that they're bad. They're just, people don't know the full story because they're just getting the BS that CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News feeds them. And that's not just about Julian Assange. That's on a bunch of issues. So that's why stuff like this needs to exist. Thank you, Chris Garrett, for this. This is how the Hunger Games came to be. Yeah, no kidding. If this merger goes through, this is going to be very, very bad if this merger goes through. And no one's talking about this. I don't think I don't know if there's been anything on the corporate media. I think there was one thing, because we talked about it. There was one thing in CNBC about this merger, and it was from the financial standpoint, so it was just a nonsensical thing. But man, so tell people about this, share this stream, make sure they know, hey, there could be a merger that's really, really going to F up our food chain. Grocery prices are through the roof right now. And once the toothpaste is out of the tube, they don't put it back in. So you have some ridiculous merger that's pretty much going to homogenize our food chain. Those high prices are never going to change. That's going to be the norm. That's how it works. You give someone a monopoly, they can price gouge you when it's something you need, i.e. food. Food. And by the way, they're trying to privatize water too. They're trying to do that. Just as an aside here. So yeah, free Assange. We got to stop this merger. You guys know it. And I do have some events coming up. I'll let you all know about that because it's important during these times that we. Did you guys hear my cat? My cat she's like, it's time for you to stop. The show's supposed to be over. I want attention. It's after 3. The show's almost over, Lucy. Did you guys hear her? Maybe you couldn't hear her, and you're like, well, Ron is losing it. He's hearing his cat. But no, she's here. Let me get her. I feel like today's show warrants a cat. It's been a very, very heavy show today. Usually there's a couple lighter things, but not today. We didn't have time for it. Lucy. All right, she left. Sorry. I was gonna be Julian Assange is a big cat guy, by the way. Julian Assange is a big cat guy. So I feel like if any show it was appropriate for a cat, today it's like, okay, just give us a kitten for a second, please. If you have a furry loved one, please hold them tightly. And thank you for this, David. Yes, I'm so happy to hear that. I have a black cat as well. Her name is Lucy. I think a lot of y'all know that, but she just walked away. I was gonna get her on camera here, but yeah. Oh, this is possible. Travers is saying she might have heard the word food. That's also possible. But no, she does know, usually around 3 o'clock my time here is when the show's over. So she's probably, just wanting me to get off the show here. But guys, I do have some events coming up. First of all, if you're in Tucson, Arizona, you can go see my movie tomorrow. Go see it, Tucson, Arizona, February 22nd. My movie Left It Wall is playing at the screening room. You can get tickets now at romplacone.com. February 29th, the movie is playing in Omaha, Nebraska. March 18th, the movie is playing in Washington, D.C., and that's a free screening because it's with a film club in Washington, D.C. So D.C., you get to see my movie for free. March 22nd, I am doing a show, a screening, and a Q&A in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Get your tickets now, Pittsburgh. I can't wait to see you. So that's March 22nd in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. April 14th, doing a show, screening, and Q&A in Los Angeles. And June 8th, We're going up to the mountains in Idlewild, California, to an amazing indie movie theater up there, and we're going to do a show screening and Q&A. Get tickets and information for all events at romplacone.com. That's Lucy again. She is really, really going off. And guys, thank you so much for being part of this. Thank you for your support. I know that this is the first time in a long time that we've really spent pretty much the entire episode on one topic. That's not common for me. Y'all know that. But I hope it was very informative as far to the Assange case. Status Coup is among the few outlets that refuses to let this story die. And so shout out to Kevin. Shout out to all of the independent media that has been on the ground there. It is a small handful of journalists, but they are out there, and it's amazing to be part of it. And we just gotta keep doing what we do, folks. We really do. So thank you all for being part of it. Thank you for your support of this network. Thank you for tuning in today. Please tell everyone about this. I'm gonna go snuggle with my cat. That's what I'm gonna go do now. And I hope you all do the same. So you guys take care. This is Ron Placone for Status Coup signing out. Don't forget the members call tomorrow at 7:30 Eastern time. There's a members call going on 7:30 Eastern time. I will not be present. Actually, I have a show tomorrow that prohibits me from being there. But I try to tune in on the members' calls when I can. But Jordan will be there. It's an amazing thing. It's something that comes along with your membership. So statuscoup.com/join. And this is Ron Placone for Status Coup signing out.